Did you just hear those ads? Do you not want to? Because Crimelines is available ad-free on Supercast, Patreon, and Apple subscriptions. You will also get access to my other twice-monthly podcast, Beyond the Files. That's where I take cases that were covered on Forensic Files and tell you the rest of the story. Links to those platforms are in the show notes. So a real quick announcement about something going on with Apple right now. They have recently announced that they will be taking a 30% cut on all Patreon support that is purchased through the Patreon app that is in the Apple App Store. And that 30% is on top of the cut that Patreon already takes. This is going to roll out on November 1st. And my understanding is that it does not apply to anyone who is currently subscribed and continues to be subscribed. It is just if you sign up after November 1st. So it won't apply to those of you currently subscribed to Crimelines or any other podcast through the Patreon app, unless you suspend your service and then have to re-sign up. There are two ways to get around this fee for those who do use the Patreon app on their iPhone. One is to sign up before November 1st for any podcasts or creators you've been thinking about supporting. The second way around it is that as of right now, this will not apply to purchases processed through the Patreon website. So if you go to the Patreon website and sign up there, you can then bypass the Apple billing fee entirely and then still log on to your account in the app. That second option is currently how it's set up. I mean, Apple may choose to close that loophole at some point, but it's not currently an issue. So don't sign up through the app, sign up on the website to save that fee. For full transparency, Patreon has given creators the option to absorb the 30% charge themselves or to pass it on to the consumers. I did some math and realized that I cannot absorb it. If I had 5,000 Patreon supporters, let's go. I'd be making enough across the board that I'd still be paying all my bills, even if Apple took 30% from people who signed up in their app. But this is a small-time podcast over here, and those just aren't my numbers. One day we can dream big, but right now it's just not a reality. So starting on November 1st, Patreon supporters who sign up through the Apple Patreon app will be charged $6.50 USD per month. If you sign up on the website, it will remain $5. Apple subscriptions, where you get the same audio content but you're not getting the messaging or the text posts, that will also be $5. Yes, Apple keeps 30% of the money given through Apple subscriptions, but it's not then on top of the Patreon cut. So it makes more sense to just go ahead and absorb that. So that's the skinny on what's going on with this Patreon Apple thing. You may have seen some podcasters talking about it online. It does really stink because it's hard enough already to make a living in this industry with everyone taking a cut of your profits along the way. But worst case scenario, I can always send one of my kids to the mines. As Lynn Hernan's health began to decline, she relied more and more on friends for help. And then, as her wealth started to evaporate, it looked like someone might be helping themselves more than they were helping Lynn. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Crimelines. This is going to be part one of a two-parter. I don't often split things up. You know I love a good long episode, but this one very quickly got away from me in length. The good news is that as I'm recording this, I'm almost done drafting part two, so I need to record and edit this one, and then I can rewrite, record, and edit part two. I have confidence it is not going to take me a full week to get all of that done, so you won't have to wait an entire week for the second part. I do put episodes on Supercast, Patreon, and Apple 48 hours early as a bonus, so basically as soon as I'm done with part two, it'll go up there, and then everyone will have it 2 days later. But we can't get to part two without starting with part one, and that starts with a woman named Lynn Hernan. Lynn was born in Wisconsin in June of 1956 to parents Bob and Lorraine. She was an only child, and reportedly she was very close to her father, Bob, but she and her mother, Lorraine, had an up-and-down relationship. And part of that had to do with some trouble Lynn found herself in. Lynn was living near her parents in Madison, Wisconsin, into her 20s. In 1982, she was arrested and charged in 4 residential burglaries alongside another man. So I looked this guy up, and he is deceased as of 2015, but after 1982, he spent a lot of time in and out of prison, unlike Lynn, who never had another theft-related arrest. Not that she didn't have another arrest, we'll get to that later, but she did not continue this pattern of crime. I don't know the full story around what exactly happened here with these home burglaries, but I do think if we look at these 2 criminal records side by side, one of these people never did this again, and the other one did it repeatedly. So I think there may be an influence here that led Lynn to being wrapped up in this situation. Lynn ended up pleading out on the charges, but the incident was published in the local paper, which is how I know the name of the man she was arrested with and could then look into his background. So thank you, newspapers.com, for that article. And they also happen to be sponsoring this episode, but we'll get into that later as well. Anyway, that negative attention was really hard on Lynn's parents. It certainly didn't help her relationship with her mother that was already strained. Lynn decided to get away from the people and the situations in Madison, and she moved out to Milwaukee, which was a pretty smart move for her. Lynn loved to be out in the sun and on the water with friends, so being right next to Lake Michigan was a dream. Another dream for Lynn was to own her own hair salon, which is a goal she eventually met. With her outgoing nature, it was a great fit for her, and eventually she was able to start renting houses that were on the lake. Not Lake Michigan, but on other smaller lakes in the area. And this gave her a great space to have people over and throw parties, a lot of parties for adults mostly. Lynn didn't have children, but she did take on the children of her friends, like nieces and nephews. So not only did she host these adult parties, she would also host parties for the kids, particularly when she would live right on a lake. According to Lynn's friends, Lynn was the party. She was a social butterfly who attracted friends everywhere she went. Something I find remarkable is that Lynn kept the same friends for decades. So she was really in the lives of their kids as they grew up. 2 of them in particular were Jessie and Anthony. Jessie was the daughter of her friend Jenny, and Anthony, who was about 10 years younger than Jessie, was her friend Corinne's son. Those 2 kids in particular were very close to Lynn, who they called Aunt Linny. She was always hands-on with them. With Jessie, Lynn would babysit when Jenny was working 3rd shift, and even hosted Jessie's high school graduation party. She would take Anthony out shopping, usually to the thrift store because Lynn loved a good bargain, and she always checked to make sure he was doing well in school. And Lynn never forgot about them on their birthdays or the holidays. She was generous, but I'm sure her friends appreciated that she was also reasonable. She never went over the top with spoiling the kids. But even as Lynn settled into this life in the Milwaukee area that she loved so much, things weren't always rosy. She had some pretty serious struggles. Some were financial, as she lived paycheck to paycheck, and paycheck to paycheck was during a good month. There were plenty of times where she was overstretched. It didn't help that Lynn had a problem with alcohol, and I think it's safe to say that Lynn's relationship with alcohol was unhealthy based on her history of DUIs, or rather OWI, which is what they call it in Wisconsin, operating while intoxicated. According to the Wisconsin courts, Lynn was arrested in May of 2007 and charged with a felony OWI because it was at least her 5th one. And a felony OWI meant that there would be prison time. Lynn ended up pleading guilty on August 16th, 2007. And this was a very difficult time for Lynn, not just because of the looming sentence, but also because her father, Bob, was dying. He had been sick for 2 years, and he literally only had days left. Her attorney filed something with the court informing them of that, and it appears, based on the court records, that Lynn was allowed to remain free on bond until sentencing, given that she continued the conditions, which included abstaining from alcohol, avoiding places that served alcohol, and she had to check in once a week with Wisconsin Community Services. They would provide oversight, administer a breathalyzer to her, and also provide some treatment options. Then, 3 days after Lynn pleaded guilty, her dad, Bob, died. Then, on October 1st, Lynn was sentenced to 3 years, with about half of that time spent behind bars. She was released on supervised release in March of 2009. So here's the thing with this. Lynn had 5 OWIs, and she needed a shock to the system to hopefully get her to stop this repeated and dangerous behavior. I think the sentence was just. I'm not debating that part at all. But from a feeling person perspective, I can't imagine Lynn going through that process while her father was dying, pleading out 3 days before his death, and then going to prison 6 weeks later. It's not like Lynn had a huge family to support her through this. She had her mother, who she was somewhat estranged from, and she had some extended family she wasn't close to. So she was facing this scary time, going to prison without a lot of support in the middle of her grief. I just imagine how hard that was for her. And unfortunately, the shock to the system of going to prison did not lead to long-term recovery. Lynn did continue or go back to drinking after her sentence was up, but I will say she did not get any more OWIs, so at least it seems to have stopped her from getting behind the wheel when she was drinking. Lynn was in her early 50s when she got out of prison, and she really started slowing down at this point. She was not just experiencing emotional setbacks from the loss of her father, going to prison and all of that. She was also having some pretty significant health issues. She had chronic back pain, which can be very limiting, particularly for someone who did hair for a living. That's a lot of time on her feet if her back hurts. Lynn was also diagnosed with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease from her decades of smoking, and she had high blood pressure, so she ended up filing for disability. Lynn had one short-lived bright spot in this time period. She and her mother, Lorraine, reconciled, but the reason behind it was more bad news. Lorraine was sick. She died in November of 2013 at the age of 85, and thanks to the reconciliation, Lynn was at her side. Though Lorraine had a lot of close friends, she died without a will and only one legal heir, Lynn. So Lynn went out to Madison to pack up her mother's house, and her friend Jenny went there to help her. Lynn let people come in to have keepsakes and such, but Lorraine's entire estate was distributed to Lynn, and it was deemed to have been a value of nearly $190,000, according to probate records. That money allowed Lynn to move into a nicer place. She got a condo right up against a golf course in Pewaukee, Wisconsin. And this was a place that she didn't rent, but rather owned. And the money gave Lynn a financial stability that she had never known before. She was 57 years old, and this was the first time in her adult life she could consistently make ends meet. But unfortunately, money cannot buy you better health, and in 2016, Lynn started having some pretty significant digestive issues on top of all the other ailments she had. One of the issues with this digestive thing, though, was that the doctors could not find what was causing it. There would be stretches where Lynn couldn't really eat anything without having stomach upset. She started eating mostly soup, which was hard on her because she used to love to cook, and now she couldn't enjoy the things she usually made. Sometimes the issues would flare up so badly that she would go to the emergency room. One time in February of 2018, Lynn ended up hospitalized after she ate bologna and peas. She developed not just sharp intestinal pain, but she also broke out in hives. Lynn was having obvious symptoms of something, but none of the testing ever got Lynn to a solid diagnosis. She was struggling to function day to day when she could barely eat, and she started relying more on friends and neighbors to help her out. Her neighbor Jean came by as much as she could and checked on Lynn, but they ended up having some type of falling out, in part due to Lynn's continued drinking. Lynn's friend Jenny came and helped out as she could, but she worked full-time, and she later admitted that dealing with Lynn could be difficult. So more and more helping Lynn out fell on Jenny's daughter, Jessie. Jessie lived in Franklin, Wisconsin with her boyfriend, and that was about 30 minutes away from Lynn. At first, Jessie would go over there once or twice a week. She'd do grocery shopping, help clean up a bit, and just get those weekly tasks done that Lynn didn't have the energy for. Sometimes she'd just keep Lynn company. As a very social person, Lynn struggled to stay home so much and to be dependent on other people's schedules just for a visit. Eventually, particularly into 2018 when Lynn was really struggling, Jessie would be there multiple times a week. Over the course of 2018, Lynn wasn't always up for visits with people, largely because she didn't want people to see her that sick. She was always someone who did her hair and her makeup and was so put together, and now she just didn't have the energy for it. She would tell people not to come by if she wasn't feeling well, but in late August or early September, Lynn was feeling up to a visit with Anthony. Now, Anthony was the other child of a friend who Lynn had taken on as a nephew. Anthony was a college student in the area, so he would try to stop in and see Lynn every so often. And when he saw Lynn in late summer of 2018, she said she had actually been feeling better and she wanted to start getting out more. Whether Lynn said that because it was the truth or she just said it for Anthony's peace of mind, we don't know. But we do know that not long after that visit, Lynn took another turn for the worse. Lynn's digestive issues got so bad that she was barely eating anything. Anything she ate, she had to practically force down. But in spite of not taking in very many calories, she had gained weight because of how bloated she was. She ended up getting admitted into the hospital in mid-September. Lynn spent about 2 weeks in the hospital, and she did get better while she was there, though they still didn't have an answer as to what happened to cause her digestive system to almost feel like it was shutting down. The medical team suggested that Lynn move from the hospital to an inpatient rehab center so she could continue recovering, but Lynn didn't want to go to essentially a nursing home. Instead, she took option B, which was to agree for a home health aide to come into the condo and help her. Basically, Lynn needed more care than a friend could do for free a few times a week, so she was put in touch with an agency. She was released from the hospital on Friday, September 28th, and the home health aide was supposed to come to assess her on Monday. The appointment got pushed out to Friday, October 5th, so Jessie was just going to spend more time at the condo with Lynn to kind of fill in that gap in care. But Lynn never made it to the home health appointment. On Wednesday, October 3rd, 2018, 5 days after Lynn was released from the hospital, Jessie called 911 around 5 p.m. to report that she had gone to Lynn's condo to check on her and found her unresponsive in her recliner. She wasn't breathing, and Jessie couldn't find a pulse. When paramedics arrived, they confirmed that 62-year-old Lynn Hernan was deceased, and there was little they could do. On the table next to her were pill bottles, and crushed pill residue was seen on her shirt. Jessie explained that Lynn usually crushed her pills before taking them since she had so much trouble digesting solids. There were no signs of a struggle or any injury to Lynn, and Jessie had told the police officers responding to the scene that Lynn had been struggling with her health for years. And then for their report, Jessie gave a full written statement about what had happened and what she had seen starting from the night before. Jessie said she was at Lynn's condo until around 8:30 on Tuesday night, and Lynn was awake, but she was very sleepy while Jessie was there. Jessie wanted to change her Chuck's pad that was under her, but Lynn did not want to get up because she was just that tired. She didn't want to move. Jessie basically coaxed her to eat a popsicle and then take her nighttime medication before she left. Around 7 a.m., Jessie came back over and Lynn was still sleeping. She woke up for a little bit while Jessie was there, but she refused to take her morning medication and she did not want to eat. Jessie said Lynn was a little hard to understand when she was talking that morning, but she understood well enough that Lynn was basically saying she wanted to be alone and for Jessie to go. Jessie had some errands to run anyway, so she told Lynn she'll just come back later, and Jessie wrote that she left around 10 a.m. Based on receipts Jessie had from these errands she ran, it looks like she probably left a bit earlier, more like 9 or 9:30. Jessie said she came back around 5 to check on Lynn again, and when she came in, her first thought was that Lynn was just still asleep in her recliner. But when she didn't respond at all to Jessie talking, Jessie checked her pulse and couldn't find it. That's when she called 911. Jessie was asked if Lynn was suicidal, and Jessie said that Lynn was definitely out of sorts in the last few days after getting out of the hospital because, once again, she was left without any clear answers about what was wrong with her, and with no answers, she couldn't get a treatment. But Jessie hesitated to say that Lynn was outright suicidal. That said, the scene looked to the investigators like it was possible. There were pills nearby, a depressed woman dealing with declining health, and it wasn't hard to imagine that could have left her hopeless. There was no note left behind, but that's not unusual. Notes are only left in anywhere from 20 to 50% of suicides. There was a note left on a notepad on a stool near the kitchen, but it was basically a house sitting and cat care instruction list that had been made out to Jessie's mother, Jenny, for a time that Lynn was in the hospital. It was dated 2015. So it's not clear why it was out 3 years later, unless it was just Lynn's standard house-sitting info and she just kept it so she didn't have to write it out every time she went into the hospital. Lynn's autopsy did not lead to an obvious cause of death. The ME noted that there were some crushed pills in the corners of Lynn's mouth, so it was looking more likely to be an overdose, whether intentional or not. And if that's what it was, it would show up on the toxicology tests. With Lynn's ongoing health issues, it was very possible that this was a drug overdose with her poor health contributing to it. Finalizing the death certificate would have to wait until they had all of those results in. And as we know from other cases, that can take several weeks. In the meantime, Jessie took on the task of calling Lynn's friends to let them know about her death and to invite them to a memorial dinner. Lynn did not want a service, and she just wanted to be cremated, but a dinner with her longtime close friends at her favorite restaurant seemed like the perfect way to remember Lynn. Jessie did tell these friends that it was suspected Lynn took her own life, which really surprised most of them. They hadn't expected that, even knowing about her health issues. So the group went out to dinner together, they shared memories, and had a bittersweet time remembering Lynn together. And then Jessie had to set about getting the estate taken care of, as she was the personal representative, which is the term Wisconsin uses for what most of us call an executor of a will. Lynn's will left pretty much everything to Jessie and Anthony, her niece and nephew, though there were some items that were supposed to go to specific people. In addition to settling the estate, Jessie was also trying to find out the results of Lynn's autopsy. She called the medical examiner's office a few times, and they said they were still working on getting the tox results back from the lab. And then one time when Jessie called, suddenly the ME had a different answer for her. this time, they couldn't tell her anything, and she needed instead to reach out to the police. And that's because of what was in the tox report, which came back in January of 2019. Lynn had therapeutic levels of her medications in her system, which included painkillers and anti-anxiety medications. Her blood levels for these medications and her stomach contents did not make it look like she took a bunch of pills before her death. Instead, Lynn had a very high amount of a drug called tetrahydrozoline, or THZ for short. The medical examiner got that report and had never seen a test positive for that drug before. And that's because it's the decongestant used in eye drops. It clears up the redness. You know that Visine commercial? It gets the red out. This is the active ingredient that gets the red out. To get the concentration that was in Lynn's blood, she would have had to ingest the eye drops. It was at a level 400 times higher than the highest concentration that's been reported after using this medication in your eyes. Of course, that didn't rule out suicide since Lynn could have drank the eye drops willingly, but it left the Emmy with some questions, like why were there crushed medications nearby if Lynn hadn't taken them? And if Lynn had all those pills laying around, why didn't she use those if she intended on taking her own life? Why did she instead drink eye drops? With these results, the case was referred back to the police for a full investigation before they could determine the manner of death. And that meant the Emmy could no longer give information to Jessie or anyone else. So Jessie was directed to the police station, and she and her mother Jenny went in on March 16th, 2019 for a sit-down interview. The investigators did not tell them that anything was found in the toxicology report. Instead, the detective acted a bit like he was just trying to get caught up on the case, didn't know much about it, and he told Jessie and Jenny that the Emmy was still doing confirmation tests. And then he just started casually asking them about Lynn. Jessie talked about how she helped Lynn out and that she did it mostly for free. Lynn didn't pay her regularly, though she would offer to help out here and there. But really, Lynn was like an aunt and sometimes even a second mother to Jessie, so it just made sense for Jessie to help her when she needed it. Jessie told the detective that she wanted to know what happened to Lynn because she just kept replaying it in her head and thought if she had just stayed or she had gotten back to the condo earlier, maybe she could have saved her. And her mom, Jenny, made a comment about wondering if the autopsy would finally show what was wrong with Lynn. Lynn had all these symptoms, but the doctors couldn't figure it out, so Jenny half wondered if maybe some of it was in Lynn's head. Jenny and Jessie were asked if there were maybe some psychological factors at play, and they both agreed that Lynn wasn't always the most reliable narrator when it came to what doctors said to her, and when it came to taking her medications properly. She would sometimes overtake her Xanax, and she didn't always follow doctors' orders. Jenny seemed to think it was possible that Lynn took her own life, and Jessie sort of agreed, but not very strongly. The interview got around to some of the people in Lynn's life, and Jessie said it was mostly just her mom, and Lynn's neighbor Jean. Lynn didn't really want other people around to the point that she was purposely pushing them away, and Jessie specifically named two of those friends. One was Keith and one was Jim. She said that both of them wanted valuable items from the estate and that Jim owed Lynn a considerable amount of money. Basically, these were not real friends, they were just people looking to take from Lynn. Jessie had brought up some things the investigators wanted to follow up on, like who was poised to get what from the estate, so Jessie agreed to email over some more information on all of that later. And when she did, Jessie wrote in that email that she had a hard time believing that Lynn took her own life. Jessie had also given the detective the contact information for a number of people in Lynn's life, so the investigators started there to talk to everyone. And these friends, who Jessie said Lynn pushed away, had a lot to say to the police. One was Lynn's cousin. Lynn had pretty much no family left, but she did have this one cousin who she wasn't exactly close to, But he was concerned enough about the situation that he called the medical examiner directly. He had heard that Lynn left her entire estate to a caregiver, and he just wanted to make sure there was nothing suspicious about the death or the will. I'm sure he's as aware as any of us are about the stories of caregivers who move in on older and or vulnerable people and then fleece them. Another person they talked to was Lynn's ex-boyfriend, Jim. She had been with him for about a decade in the 80s and early 90s. Jim said they met at a music festival, and he thought he never had a shot with someone like Lynn. She was just too far out of his league, but he asked her out anyway, and then they were together for the next 10 years. And then, after they broke up, they remained friends for the next 20-plus years, which included Lynn becoming friends with his new girlfriend. Jim told the investigators that he was surprised Lynn had taken her own life, and he didn't entirely believe it. As for when he had last talked to Lynn, Jim told the police that he tried to call Lynn about a week or so before she went into the hospital in September. He said a young woman answered the phone, and he heard an older woman's voice in the background. Neither of these women were Lynn, and he was told not to worry about Lynn and to never call that phone again. It was a weird phone call since Jim and Lynn had been friends for decades and he hadn't heard otherwise from Lynn. So he made a mental note to try to get in touch with Lynn later and figure out what was going on. But before he could reach her, Lynn called him from the hospital. They talked for a bit and then made some vague plans for him to come visit after she got released. Jim said he later learned that the women on the phone were Jenny and her daughter Jessie, but he never had the chance to ask Lynn more about what was going on because she died just 5 days after her release from the hospital and before they had set their plans for him to come visit. Because Jim never went over there between the release from the hospital and Lynn's death, he was crossed off the suspect list should this prove to be a homicide. He simply didn't have the opportunity. But there was one more person who was set to inherit considerably from Lynn's estate, and that was Anthony. He told the police that Jesse was handling the estate, but he did have some questions about how it was being handled. He was a college student in his early 20s, so he just accepted Jesse's word about how things were going with settling the estate. She was in her mid-30s, she was helping raise her boyfriend's kids, and so she just had a lot more experience with life. But Anthony mentioned that there were a few weird things that came up, like how Lynn said there was money in a safe deposit box that was set aside for him to help with his college tuition, but he never got it. When he asked Jesse about it, she said the money was gone. He had asked other questions about the estate, like what happened to Lynn's Jeep, and Jesse said Lynn had signed it over to her mom, Jenny, already. Anthony also asked about an expensive bracelet that Anthony's Uncle Keith thought Lynn had intended to go to him. Jesse told Anthony that it made more sense for them to just sell it. Lynn had bought it about a year before her death, so it's not like it had huge sentimental value, and it wasn't any type of heirloom. Lynn had left behind some pretty significant debts, so Jesse suggested that they sell the bracelet to help pay off those debts so that there was something at the end of the day for the two of them to inherit. The investigators did follow up on this bracelet, and they found evidence that Jesse did sell it, along with other items of Lynn's jewelry, at a jeweler who buys back gold and gemstones. Anthony agreed to have the bracelet sold to cover the debts, but the debts Lynn had left seemed strange. He said that Lynn had mentioned to him before her death that she didn't know where all of her money was going, and then he started getting these reports from Jesse about the estate, and he saw there was a ton of credit card debt. He didn't know Lynn to use credit cards. She had a Kohl's store card that she would use, but she paid it off in the store with cash. But that was the only time he saw Lynn use a credit card. Beyond not using credit cards, Lynn was frugal even after she got her inheritance. Plus, Lynn hardly went out those last couple of years, and she didn't do online shopping. If she wanted to buy something online, she would have someone else do it for her and give them the cash. So how could she have spent so much money without anything to show for it? Seeing all these debts coming through really surprised Anthony. We're talking more than a dozen credit cards with balances of $5,000, $13,000, $14,000. These are not small amounts. When Anthony asked Jesse about them, she sent him 52 receipts showing that she paid these debts and others, so he just accepted what she told him. After all the debts were paid and the condo was sold, the estate was settled in May of 2019. Lynn's estate was worth, at the end of the day, $27,000, which still didn't make sense to Anthony. Her condo alone was worth so much more than that. But the two split the money that was left, and then the estate got reopened when more claims came in, including a Bank of America bill for more than $11,000. As all of that is playing out in probate court, the investigators started looking into Jesse a bit more, based on the suspicions of others in Lynn's life. And they found out that in 2010, Jesse had been arrested for identity theft and forgery. From what I can tell, she took out a title loan, or maybe more than one, using family members' names and identities. In 2011, Jesse pleaded guilty and was given 8 years total. From the records I can see in the Wisconsin court lookup and the Department of Corrections, it looks like she was supposed to serve 2 years behind bars and 6 years of supervised release. She ended up serving 1.5 years before her first release, but then ended up being locked up again in November of 2013 on a parole violation, and she was incarcerated until February of 2016. It was not long after Jesse was released the second time that she started helping Lynn out here and there with increasing frequency as Lynn's health declined. And in looking at the debt Lynn supposedly incurred in the years before her death, it seemed to all happen after Jesse got more involved in Lynn's life. That set off alarm bells given Jesse's history of fraud related to identity theft. So they decided to take an even closer look at Lynn's finances. This took a while to uncover everything, but we're just going to get into all of it now. The broad view to start with, when Jesse got out of prison in 2016, the investigators say that Lynn had $250,000 in her money market account. This money was primarily from her inheritance from her mother. 2.5 years later, when Lynn died, there was $88 left in that account. $250,000 to $88 in 2.5 years. The way Lynn used her money market account normally was that she would have a set amount transferred into her regular account to pay bills. At the time, money market accounts and savings accounts had limits on the withdrawals. You could only do 6 a month. So it makes more sense to do one transfer and then pay the smaller amounts out of a checking account. That is something a lot of people do, including those with unstable sources of income like podcasters. All the money goes into one account and then the monthly budget gets moved over once a month. The investigation showed that the money market account had 22 checks written from it. 2 of these checks were clearly written by Lynn. She used one to buy her Jeep and another to buy that expensive bracelet. The other 20 checks seemed less clear as to their purpose. There was always something written in the memo lines, but then the checks weren't sent directly to those places. They instead went mostly to Jesse Kerchevsky. And based on Jesse's bank records, she spent that money herself. It's not like the money went to Jesse's account for some reason and then Jesse was paying Lynn's bills. The money went to Jesse, and it stayed with Jesse until Jesse spent it. Some of these checks were obviously not for what they said they were for. Like there was a check from April of 2017 for $12,000, and it had a memo on it that said it was an IRS payment. But in 2017, Lynn actually got a tax refund. She didn't have a bill. There was another from November of 2017 that had the memo Dr. Tumor Removal, but Lynn had no such procedure. Jesse spent that money, some of it on actual items, but it looked like there were a number of trips to the casino. At least one casino trip was while Lynn was in the hospital, so it's not like Lynn went with Jesse and just paid for everything. She was in the hospital and Jesse used her money at a casino. And it wasn't just this money market account. In the 2 weeks Lynn was hospitalized that final time in September of 2018, $4,000 was spent using her debit card from her main bank account. While Lynn was laid up in the hospital, someone was out and about using her actual physical card to spend thousands. Then, 2 days before Lynn's death, there were 2 electronic checks written from Lynn's account. One was for $5,000 that went to Jesse, and the other was for over $2,000 that went to pay Jesse's mom's rent. Now, here's why it's important to note that these were electronic checks. Lynn didn't use e-checks. She didn't shop online, and she didn't do online banking. She did not embrace technology in pretty much any way, shape, or form. The most technological thing she had was a television, and she used it to watch her old movies on. Lynn did have a cell phone, but it was mostly just to use in case of an emergency when she left the home. Lynn was not sending electronic checks to anyone, but we do know who very likely was. The same day those checks were issued, Jesse downloaded the banking app for the bank where that account was, and that's a bank where she did not have her own account at. The total transferred from Lynn's accounts to Jesse's over 2.5 years turned out to be around $130,000. And then there was also a loan. In February of 2018, Lynn, and I'm saying Lynn in quotes here, applied for a loan of $30,000. The phone number on the loan application was not Lynn's phone number, it was Jesse's. The account the loan paid into was originally Jesse's account, but she added Lynn's name to it right before the loan was approved. I mean, she had to because the account has to be in the name of the person who's taking out the loan. Now, if Lynn wanted to take out a $30,000 loan for some reason, she had 3 accounts she could have had it deposited to. Instead, it went into an account that was owned and used by Jesse. A closer look at the documents used to secure that loan showed that they appeared to have been forged. And the loan was still outstanding when Lynn died, but Jesse did not list it on the estate accounting, but she then took funds from the estate and paid it back. So it's almost like she stole the money twice. But get this, the spending did not stop with Lynn's death. On the day Lynn died, while Jesse was out running errands, she bought a 75-inch TV and an Apple Watch for $1,900. Then, 15 minutes later, she opened a store credit card in Lynn's name at JCPenney, and she tried to buy $446 worth of items. But the card, because it had just been applied for, had a $200 cap, so she came back 2 hours later and spent $137. She then spent some money at Kohl's, about $1,300. She went back to Lynn's condo at that point, found her dead, and called 911. And then, days later, Jesse used a different credit card, again in Lynn's name, to buy $3,000 worth of furniture. The furniture was delivered to the home Jesse lived at with her boyfriend, Scott. Because of how much money had been drained out of Lynn's accounts and how much credit card and loan debt had accumulated in her name, by the time the condo was sold to pay everything off, Lynn's estate was down to the $27,000 in May of 2019, which Jesse then took half of as the rightful heir. You might wonder how Jesse was able to take $50,000 to $80,000 out of the estate while Anthony was getting reports and being told where all the money was going to. Well, according to an attorney Anthony hired to look over the estate and the accounts, the 52 receipts Jesse sent to Anthony appeared to be forged, and rather sloppily. The amounts on the invoices didn't even match the amounts Jesse was reporting. In contacting the businesses, multiple businesses confirmed that the invoices were not from them. All of this financial information spelled trouble for Jesse. For one, it made the investigators start wondering about her financial motive to see Lynn dead. And two, there were clear violations of her release conditions happening. I know when she was on bond, she was not allowed to go to the casino, and I imagine there were similar conditions put on her while she was on parole. Certainly, forging documents would have been a violation, as would taking out a JCPenney credit card in the name of a woman who Jesse herself claimed wasn't with her that day. And I also saw something about how she was suspected in another fraud because she tried to open an account in a neighbor's name. It was really adding up against Jesse, and this meant that the investigators didn't have to wait to determine if Lynn's death was a murder or not to arrest Jesse, because she had violated the conditions of her release for the original 2011 fraud charges. So she was arrested on July 9th, 2019. And the same day Jesse was arrested, she agreed to sit down with the investigators. They started talking to her about some of the money issues related to Lynn, and Jesse insisted she never spent any of Lynn's money without permission. And then they told her that they had the toxicology results back. They said that the drug found in her system was tetrahydrozoline, and like most people, Jesse didn't know what that was, so she asked, and they said it is the active ingredient found in eye drops. Jesse said that Lynn used eye drops all the time for her eyes because she complained they were very dry, and that she went through Visine like crazy. Jesse said she would go through 4 bottles a week, and she was just known for excessively using eye drops. Now, the investigators had talked to pretty much everyone in Lynn's life by this point, and absolutely no one mentioned eye drops or dry eyes, even when talking about her other medical complaints and medications. Jesse and her mother Jenny also hadn't mentioned it back when they spoke to the police in March. I don't routinely use eye drops, but my husband does, so I asked him how long it took to go through a bottle. He said he probably buys 1 bottle every 4 to 6 months. But according to Jesse, Lynn was going through 4 bottles a week. A bottle of Visine has 15 milliliters, so if we are on the conservative side of things, that means there's about 250 drops in the bottle. Yes, I looked it up. So now let's say she does 4 bottles a week. Let's multiply that by 4, and we are at 1,000 eye drops used per week. Now, we're going to do the math with me, so now we're going to divide that by 7 so that we can see how many she used per day. And we get about 143. It's more like 142.8571, but we don't have to be pedantic here. So she uses almost 143 drops per day. But let's go ahead and do 142 because nobody's using half a drop. Divide it by 2, and she's putting 71 drops in each eye every day to go through 4 bottles of Visine. That makes absolutely no sense. And it didn't make sense to the investigators either. So they asked Jesse if she ever saw Lynn ingest the eye drops. And Jesse said no. Jesse seemed to think that there may be other factors at play here. She told them that Lynn was not great with her regular medications. She drank while she took them, even though she shouldn't. So the detective asked, did she see Lynn with a drink on the morning of her death? And Jesse said she couldn't remember. Lynn would regularly drink vodka whenever she wanted, so it wouldn't be out of the ordinary to have seen that, so it didn't stick out in Jesse's mind whether she did or not. For the record, the autopsy showed that she was not intoxicated at the time of her death. The detective asked Jesse if she ever said to Lynn, maybe don't mix your alcohol and pills, and Jesse said that if they knew Lynn, they'd just know that that's what she did and there was no talking to her about it. This was the first time Jesse was being told that they were looking at Lynn's death as a homicide, And she said that was an absolutely insane idea to her. And then she asked if that's why she was there, and they said it was one of the reasons. Jessie adamantly denied that she gave Lynn the eye drops aside from buying them for her during grocery store runs. She didn't ever see Lynn drink them, but she said she knew Lynn was tired of being sick and that she had been suicidal. This was a shift from her original statement back in March and that follow-up email where she said she didn't believe Lynn took her own life. So she went from not believing it to now saying she was aware Lynn was suicidal. The interview wrapped up and Jessie went back to lockup for the night, but the next day she said she wanted to talk to the police again. In fact, over the next several days, Jessie spoke with the police 5 more times, and her story changed incrementally over these interviews. With Jessie's initial story, she said she didn't know anything about Lynn's death, even saying she doubted the ME's ruling about the eye drops. She brought up the mixing pills and alcohol, insinuating that may have led to her death, whether on purpose or accidentally. But then they told Jessie in a follow-up interview that the scene actually looked staged. In spite of the pill bottles and crushed medication, the only drug over the lethal limit in her system was from eye drops. And there were no bottles of eye drops around, so if she drank them, someone must have thrown them away. So then we get a shift in Jessie's story. She said she never saw Lynn drink the eye drops, but then said she actually knew Lynn was adding them to her vodka. Jessie claims she didn't mention it in the first interview because she didn't see her do it on the day of her death. Jessie then took another step and admitted that a few weeks before Lynn's death, which would have been around the time she was hospitalized, Jessie herself had put 2 drops of Visine into some vodka for Lynn at her request. So why was Lynn drinking Visine? According to Jessie, Lynn claimed she got some type of numbing effect from it. This is not an effect anyone else in the history of forever has ever reported, and if they did, you'd think Visine would be locked behind the pharmacy counter, but it's not. We protect cold medicine more than we do Visine because drinking Visine does not deliver a pleasant effect. It makes you sleepy, dizzy, causes headaches, and yes, it causes digestive problems. You know, the same thing Lynn had been complaining about for several months. Now, eventually, Jessie's story shifted again, and she said that on the day Lynn died, she had given her a water bottle that she knew had eye drops in it. She said she didn't kill Lynn, and she was not the one who put 6 bottles of Visine into a bottle of water, but she did know what was in there when she handed it to Lynn. They asked Jessie why she gave Lynn a water bottle with so much Visine in it, and she said it's because Lynn thought it would be a good idea to drink it. Lynn said she needed it because she needed to sleep. She said they had a little bit of an argument over it because Jessie didn't want to give it to her, but she ended up doing it anyway, assuming Lynn would be fine since she had been drinking it for so long. So, to recap, Jessie went from interview 1 of having never seen her drink Visine to interview 2 where she said she saw her put some drops into vodka a few times, but not on the day she died, to the next interview where Jessie said she handed her a water bottle with 6 bottles of eye drops in it. It's like every time they questioned Jessie, she took whatever new information they gave her and worked it into the story to present for the next interview. Jessie was asked if this was some type of Dr. Kevorkian type thing, an assisted suicide, and Jessie said that Lynn had made comments about how she wanted Jessie's help when the time came, but Jessie always said she wouldn't do it. She knew that Lynn was sick of being sick of not getting answers from doctors, but Jessie did not want to be involved. So Jessie, in spite of having a hard time in March believing this was a suicide, now claimed she knew Lynn was suicidal. And then she went a step further and said she caught Lynn actively trying to take her own life. Jessie said Lynn searched online for things like suicide pills and ghost guns. A ghost gun, if you don't know, is a gun that you assemble yourself from parts that you buy from different vendors, often online. Since the gun is not assembled by the manufacturer and sold as a gun, It doesn't have a serial number, which is what makes it a ghost. Jesse went as far as to say Lynn had 2 guns at one point. One, Jesse literally took out of Lynn's hand one day about 2 months before her death. But the guns were no longer in Lynn's possession because Jesse got rid of them both. But you might remember that Lynn never shopped online, instead giving her friend cash to make purchases for her. And Lynn didn't even do online banking, yet she managed to figure out how to buy the parts for an unregistered and untraceable gun. And then she did it twice. The police were not buying any of Jesse's stories because, 1, a lot of them didn't make sense, and 2, they had evidence she didn't know about. And she got a clue that they had it when they asked her a question I don't think she expected. They asked her why she told her boyfriend that Lynn was in a coma. So to back up a little bit, Jessie was living with her boyfriend Scott at the time of Lynn's death, and she was still with him when the police arrested her on July 9th. And so when they searched her belongings, that included Scott's belongings since it was his home, and the police asked if they could take a look at his phone. Scott agreed, and the police had his phone for about 2 days. What they found there was very interesting. On May 13th, 2018, months before Lynn's death, Jessie texted Scott telling him that Lynn had overdosed on pills and was in a coma in the hospital. The police asked him about this, and Scott said, yeah, Lynn was in a coma from that point on until her death. He said Jessie would go to the hospital to visit Lynn and deal with paperwork and such since she had power of attorney. Jessie told Scott Lynn fell into a coma that she was never in, and then told him for months that she was still in it, and then when she died, he assumed that meant she died in the hospital where she was in a coma. Jessie first denied she told Scott this, but the investigators had the text messages. The question was, why would Jessie have made this up? One thought was that she initially said it when she and Scott were fighting and on the verge of breaking up, so it may have been a ploy for sympathy. How could he break up with her when she was dealing with this major crisis? And in that regard, it worked. Scott said that what was happening with Lynn made whatever issue they were having seem minor and petty, and so they reconciled. But my question is, why did Jessie keep the story going? That seems a little less clear. And Scott didn't seem to be able to bring any enlightenment to it. When Jessie called Scott from jail, Scott was angry with her, and she asked him why he was being mean, and he said that she had lied to him about so many things. She said she had only lied about one thing, the coma, and he said that there were a lot of other little lies along the way that she used to keep that story going. But Scott told Jessie that what really bothered him was that Jessie didn't seem bothered at all by the fact that she had spent months and months lying to him and his family. At this point, Scott did not know the extent of the lies, but I'm sure he suspected it was more than just the coma thing. Another lie that she told that he would find out was that there was a period in their relationship for about 4 to 6 months where she lied about going to work. She had lost her job, but every morning she got up, she got dressed, and she left the house like she was going to work, and then came home several hours later. Scott didn't notice that she had lost her job because they didn't have any joint banking accounts, and Jessie always had money, so it looked like she had an income. So even with Jessie telling Scott that she only lied to him about one thing, which was the coma, she was actually still lying. And I think Scott's observation that Jessie not being bothered about the lying was the real issue is so relatable. I honestly could not live the way Jessie did, running from one lie or deception to the next and always trying to get away with it. I could never do any of that. And people who do, and seem unfazed by it, seem dangerous to me. They are always kicking that ball down the field, confident the field will last forever, but what happens when it doesn't? I mean, I feel anxious thinking about this too much, and the truth is that some people don't feel that anxiety at all. So Scott is upset on this phone call for obvious reasons, and he wants to know from Jessie why she lied, And she said her reason for lying to Scott was so that she could protect him. Of course, the follow-up to that is protect him from what? Scott didn't know, and Jesse did not elaborate. So did Jesse mean protect him from being implicated in stealing from Lynn, or in a plan to eventually kill Lynn? Or was there some benign protection he needed? We don't know, and I don't recommend fighting with your boyfriend on a recorded jailhouse line, because it can be interpreted so many ways, and it will be used against you in court and on my podcast. But let's get back to Scott's phone, because this is not the only thing they found. There were more texts from Jesse that were incriminating. On January 12th, 2019, so 3 months after Lynn's death, Jesse was out with friends. The next morning, Jesse started texting Scott that she was really sick. She said she was throwing up blood. About half an hour or so later, Jesse texted again about her digestive issues with a little bit of TMI, and he replied, "Ew," and he was sorry. They texted back and forth for a bit, and Jesse said she was going to urgent care. There, they took some blood and were talking about giving her fluids. Eventually, she texted that they had found tetrahydrozoline in her system. The doctor told her someone had likely slipped it in her drink, as it can be used as a date rape drug because it causes drowsiness. So in January, Jesse was claiming she got poisoned by tetrahydrozoline, and then when the police asked her about it in July, she said, "What's that?" Jesse even texted to Scott that she had been Googling the effects of tetrahydrozoline, and it was freaking her out. So she clearly knew what this medication was, even though she told the police she didn't. This was just another case of Jesse's story changing with new information. She first said she did text Scott about the drug, but she was actually talking about another friend of hers who got slipped the drug and had gone to urgent care. But later she said, yeah, she had actually taken some of the eye drops herself to see what Lynn had experienced with that numbing effect she got, and she lied about the circumstances so Scott wouldn't be mad at her. So that's the basic evidence they got off Scott's phone, so then they looked at Jesse's phone. So you remember how Jesse said Lynn had searched up suicide pills and ghost guns? It was actually Jesse's phone that was used to search those things up. There were searches for cyanide, criminal poisoning, and suicide that had been made in the months prior to Lynn's death. The searches were not deleted from Jesse's phone until February of 2019. What happened in February of 2019? That's when Jesse called the medical examiner for an update and was told for the first time that the police had taken over the case. According to Jesse, though, this was just a case of Lynn having borrowed her phone to make these searches. The police followed up on the lead about the ghost guns and found that they were purchased with a credit card in Lynn's name, but we know that means nothing. They did note that there was a phone call made about one of these guns or gun parts, and the person on the phone was attempting to change the delivery address, and that phone call came from Jesse's phone. They also saw an app on Jesse's phone that allows you to mask your cell number. Your number gets hidden on a caller ID, and it'll just display a random number instead. Looking into this more, they found that there were some calls to Lynn's bank that were recorded. I'm sure you've heard it. This call might be recorded for quality assurance. It also may be recorded and turned over to the police if you're suspected in a murder. The voice on those calls claiming to be Lynn Hernan was 100% Jesse's voice. As the net was closing in on Jesse, she claimed she had evidence that would exonerate her completely. She had a stack of letters Lynn had left behind in her condo that no one had seen before, and they were essentially suicide notes. Not just that, but Lynn had taped an audio recording that would verify these notes were hers. Jesse claimed she bagged up the audio recording along with parts from the ghost gun, Visine bottles with Lynn's fingerprints on them, and other assorted papers, and she buried them in a park near where Jesse lived. She offered to bring the police to the park to recover the items, but they were not going to take her to the scene. She described to them where they were. They were not that far behind an apartment complex, and she even marked on a map where she buried everything. So over a video link, like a FaceTime call, the police went out to the park while Jesse guided them. In the end, the spot with the hidden exonerating evidence was never found. The state had taken their time in building all of this evidence against Jesse. They had a lot of financial information to sift through. Believe it or not, I did not give you all of it. And they had timelines to build. They had Lynn's health and decline. They had Lynn's finances. They had Jesse's finances. To watch Jesse's spending go up as Lynn's account is being drained was going to be very powerful for a jury. And they had the time to do all this because Jessie was stuck in prison because they revoked her parole. The day before she was set to be released, on June 4th, 2021, 34-year-old Jesse Kerchevsky was charged with the first-degree murder of Lynn Hernan and 2 counts of theft. One charge for $144,000 stolen before Lynn's death, and one for the $80,000 taken after. So when Jesse was released on the 5th, it was right into law enforcement hands. The case then took even longer to go to trial, in large part due to her attorneys withdrawing from the case repeatedly. She wasn't Sarah Boone level with 7, 8, 9 attorneys, more like 4 attorneys, but that meant the trial didn't start until October of 2023, 5 years after Lynn Hernan's death, and that's where we'll pick up with next week's episode. This trial has more information that came out, but the real story is what happened after the trial. The State Bar Ethics Committee had to be consulted. I've not seen anything like it, but again, that's for the next episode. It'll be shorter than this one, but it's definitely something you're going to want to hear. Thank you for listening. If you want more content, check out my other show, Crimelines and Consequences, wherever you get your podcasts. I also offer bonus content and ad-free listening at patreon.com/crimelines or through the Apple Podcast app. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crimelines, you can give a one-time donation at basementfourproductions.com/support.